So if you go to our Medium page, this is medium.com OREL group.
Oh, hey.
Yeah, I did do a post on this paper when it came out on Thursday. So this paper, we have one iteration of it previously, which was where we put it on the archive, I think last summer. So we had been working on this paper from about, I think we got the request to do, or the invitation to do it in like 2024, early
Yeah.
2024. And we did the
I,
paper and we reviewed it in our Cybernetics meeting, the draft, and then we put it on the archive. And then, it's been revised in the archive. So it's been living in sort of open access land and archive land for a while. And then, we prepared it for the special issue. So it's there on the archive, but it's also in the special issue as of Thursday. So just so you know, the sort of the vintage of the paper. We've been working on it for a couple of years, and we have like different sort of traces of it in the world. So, but I did prepare a post on this. So this is the post about the special issue. So this is great because now we have our paper in the context of the special issue, which maybe makes more sense as to why we wrote it the way we did. So this is the special issue here, the announcement, our article in Royal Society A on the Evergood Regulator Theorem as a world model is out today. Part of the special issue on world models and natural and artificial intelligence. And there's the link. And so our paper, which is called A Good Regulator May Provide a World Model for Intelligent Systems, is now available as part of the Royal Society A special issue, World Models in Natural and Artificial Intelligence. And so they actually prepared an initial article. Every time you have a special issue, there's usually an introductory article that kind of goes over the different articles in the special issue and their contribution to the overall theme. So this theme was world models in natural and artificial intelligence. And so if you go through the article or the special issue, you'll see that they're different articles and they take different perspectives on the same idea of a world model. So this is kind of the part where they talk about our article. So our co-authors here argue that the classic Evergood regulator theorem, or EGRT, of cybernetics can be reconceived as a framework for understanding world modeling in all intelligent systems. The authors propose that effective regulation requires informational correspondences between regulators and the systems they control, such that regulators contain sufficiently complete representations to maintain stability across disturbances, feedback, and changing environmental conditions. So this is basically coming from this idea of the Evergood regulator theorem, that a regulator basically has a model in it of the system. It's not an exact model, but it's pretty close. And that model is refined by interactions with the system so that in ideal cases or under ideal conditions, you get this sort of ergodic mapping or this one-to-one correspondence between the regulator and the system. But oftentimes you can't achieve that. So there is this iterative process of feedback, and you have to build that, refine that representation. And then, of course, you can also use an observer that can supervise that process. And in machine learning terms, that would be like supervised learning, where or like a human in the loop, where you're basically guiding that feedback and guiding that world model towards this one-to-one correspondence. So they consider how adaptive mapping and modeling and control can be achieved by self-organizing systems as they couple with the world and generate dynamics that preserve system structure. These concepts are applied to the distinction between purposeful and non-purposeful behavior, suggesting that the illusion of goal-directedness can emerge from feedback processes, with second-order cybernetics providing oversight through internal models that evaluate and refine regulator performance. So second-order cybernetics is basically this model of the observer in the loop So you have an observer, you have a regulator, and you have a system. And it's interesting that W.R. Ashby didn't really consider the second order cybernetics instance of the regulator theorem. This is something we introduce in the paper. So this is, kind of getting to this model that we're building of historical model for a world model, and then an approach for the world model, and then we're applying it to different problems or non-traditional computing paradigms that show how this would work in the real world. So we actually introduced a couple of sort of dynamical systems examples for how this would work in a machine learning context. So one was sort of a model of diffusion, where you had in machine learning, diffusion is where you take images and you add noise and you train the model on an image, and you add noise to the image and you try to encode that model as a model with noise. And so it's like if I give you a bunch of pictures, you can obviously train a model on those pictures, and you can recover a model that can identify those pictures and put them into different classes. And sometimes it can identify images that it hasn't seen before, but sometimes it can't. Oftentimes it can't. And so the idea of adding noise is that you're adding in variability, and that variety helps the model to generalize. And this is actually something W.R. Ashby argued in his idea of the ever-good regulator theorem, where variety was actually quite important in terms of adding robustness to the model, allowing the model to make that one-to-one correspondence with the system. So it's like if you see a lot of instances of something, or you have a lot of states from which to choose from, that's oftentimes what the real world system has to offer. You can't often say that whatever you kind of come up with as a representation for your model is always going to match the real world, because the real world always has exceptions to it, always has a lot more complexity than what you can come up with. So that's kind of the idea there. And it's interesting because people don't talk about it in that way in machine learning. They usually just talk about like generalization. They talk about like, different types of strategies like data augmentation or other things where you're adding in parameters and things like that. But they don't usually talk about variety as being the key. And so, and then in diffusion, you have this backward step where you're recovering images from being embedded in noise, and it improves, if you add in the forward and backward diffusion steps, it improves the behavior of the model. We considered this in the context of applying the Evergood regulator theorem to forwards and backwards diffusion, as it's defined in machine learning, but also as it's defined in physics as just kind of a diffusion process. Then we also talked about an example of avalanches where you have nonlinear data, and how you can build a model that responds and predicts nonlinear avalanches or nonlinear time series or sequences, which might be useful for large language models. It might be useful for other types of behavioral data, or even like neuroimaging data or something like that. And then our third example was with procedural learning, where you train a model on one set of parameters, and then you switch to a different model with a different set of parameters, and then you combine those as sort of a generalized learning process. You'll have to go to the paper to see kind of the details of that, the way we work it out. But they're very much like, these examples of how the good regulator would work and interact with data. Okay, so Alicea et al. Show how fundamental connections between world modeling and agency can be traced back to central principles of cybernetics. If regulators are to maintain a system's states within particular bounds, they must in some way be able to encode enough information about those states to model the complexities of the systems they attempt to govern/control. This account also speaks to the potentially broad scope of world modeling and agentic phenomena, and that many of these principles, including apparent goal-directedness, can be identified in the often remarkable adaptivity, one of the hallmarks of intelligence, in quotes, because as you'll see in the special issue, intelligence is we think we know what intelligence is, but oftentimes it's not very well defined at all. And so one of the articles actually talks about intelligence as a question, whether we actually know enough about intelligence to say that something can have a world model. But anyways, so often remarkable adaptivity of seemingly mindless physical processes such as avalanches and sand piles. However, qualitative differences may be found in systems capable of second-order cybernetics, so governing systems modeling their own governance processes. So again, you not only have the supervised aspect of observers, it's not just about supervised learning, it's not just about putting humans in the loop, but it's about this recursive governance of processes. So like if you have a process that you're governing sort of at the very fine time scale, like you're giving feedback in say the next time step, and you're always doing that, it can often lead to a problem with trying to identify larger scale phenomena. So the avalanche is a very good example of this, where you have a long time series. That time series often it displays these avalanches at a certain frequency that are not predictable, first of all, but also don't just occur based on the previous time steps behavior. It's a cumulative process that's nonlinear. So a lot of times in avalanches, it's where there are a bunch of accumulated events that lead to an avalanche, but there are all sorts of contexts in which an avalanche can occur, all sorts of time scales at which these cumulative events can sit. And so we really need the perspective of a longer term observation to really understand when and where these avalanches will occur. And so this is where we can place an observer in the system to sort of supervise that feedback and say, something didn't happen in the last time step, but it will happen over maybe 1,000 time steps, and integrate that into the model. So that's actually interesting from this perspective of trying to predict things that don't necessarily lead directly from the training data in a machine learning model. This is in line with statements by Hofstadter, as well as Prema Kumar and Krakauer. So these were people who contributed to the volume. So Krakauer, one of our favorites, contributed to the volume. Hofstadter, a famous cognitive scientist that we know of, contributed to the special issue, and other people as well. We'll look at the author list. It's quite interesting. Regarding the importance of strange loops, self-modeling, and self-compression for emergent intelligence. So this is something that where there are all these different concepts for how intelligence kind of works, what's its secret sauce. People have proposed different mechanisms, and we're kind of linking our cybernetic averted regulator model to some of these larger concepts. The following contribution further explores connections between complexity and world modeling, with formal models potentially fundamental differences between biological intelligences and currently predominant approaches to constructing artificial systems. So yeah, that was our kind of part from our part of this this special issue. So this is the special issue, World Models in Natural and Artificial Intelligence. And this quote that I just read was from the sort of the introductory article here, which we'll go through this table of contents in a second here. So let me go to the special issue. Here it is. So, like I said, all special issues have this introductory article. And this one was World Models, Artificial General Intelligence, and the Hard Problems of Life-Mind Continuity. So this isn't just about AI and world models. This is about sort of this idea of life-mind continuity is something that Michael Levin has advocated for, where you have this diversity of minds in different parts of the tree of life, and you have to think broadly about this, not just in the terms of the tree of life, but in terms of machines and in terms of artificial systems, and how that fits into these minds, this concept of the mind. As you know, the concept of the mind is quite fuzzy in a lot of cases, where we have to sort of discern whether something is a mind or something is a brain, or whether those things are separate entities. And this is a central theme in cognitive science that philosophers of cognitive science have struggled with for centuries. So this is definitely kind of try to contribute to this, sort of bolstering this not just the idea of world models, but also this larger theoretical question. So there's this article that actually comes before it in the special issue on the representation complexity of model-based and model-free reinforcement learning. This is Hanlin Zhu, Baihe Huang, and Stuart Russell. Then the main article, which is Adam Safran, Michael Levin, Victoria Clement, Zara, Dalton, Adil. These are people I know from Active Inference Institute. So these are people who are around the Active Inference Institute. They're doing this. They have this perspective of active inference, but also we have people like David Ha, Arina Risch, Melanie Mitchell. These are people who work in machine learning and in that area. We also have
It's quite an interesting group of people. I
yeah
actually didn't really realize until I I've been able to look at anything in depth. So I don't know if we're going to cover any of the other articles next or soon. But
we'll talk about it a
Melanie
little bit.
Mitchell is very much the um, critical of certain things in the AI space. Gershman is Harvard neuroscience guy.
Yeah,
And Josh Tenenbaum is our MIT cognitive science fellow who I mentioned a lot, especially a couple of years ago.
yeah.
It's a really interesting mix of folks. So I'm curious how the introduction plays out. If it's more, is it very synthetic or is it just sort of presenting different facets?
Well, I mean, they have to go through the articles, and we'll look at it in a minute. So yeah,
Yeah.
then finally we have David Krakauer, who's a complexity person at Santa Fe,
Yes.
Sam Gershman, and Josh Tenenbaum, who are like in cognitive science and neuroscience. So we have this very diverse group of people contributing to this article. So this is the introductory article. Um, Again, a very broad sort of take on this. Let's see. This special issue examines how natural and artificial intelligences, as they call AIs, model the world, and what this modeling reveals about cognition and relationships between life and mind. So it's very broad and kind of bringing all these things together. There hasn't been. I mean, cognitive science a lot of times tends to sort of dwell, in a sense, on human cognition, because human cognition is like that example we have of a high degree of intelligence,
Ooh.
or like the difference between like animal behavior and human cognition. But actually, of course, there are all these perspectives on animal cognition, and there are all these perspectives on how cognition isn't just something that booped into existence and humans did, but rather is this longer term process of evolution and of things generated by a brain instead of just kind of being a piece of software that you run. And so that this is kind of the idea here. Rather than adopting a single definition, this collection considers how world models function and emerge in biological and artificial systems. So, that, of course, they're also bringing in artificial systems like AI systems, or bioengineered systems in the case of organoids, or things like that. exploring a diverse range of world modeling, including causal, self-referential, individual goal-directed, collective, and narrative forms. So there is actually this large, it goes well beyond like just thinking about the like things adjacent to AI and kind of really thinking about even things like narrative forms of world modeling and collective behaviors. A recurring theme is the extent to which current AI systems, trained on vast quantities of data, learn the context-sensitive, temporally embedded, and value-laden dimensions of world modeling. So this is where we have this distinction between merely learning from like just throwing data into a machine, stuffing it in there, and then getting something out that suits our needs, and thinking about the structure of that data instead and saying, what is it about the data set or what is it about the training process before we even think about getting training data? What is it about that training process that can help us to sort of build a world model that's useful? So this is kind of and you're going to see in the special issue, if you read through it, all the different ways in which you could do this. So we want to be able to characterize diverse biological intelligences, or whether their impressive capabilities arise primarily from statistical surface regularities. So, maybe it's just a matter of you take a bunch of data and you stuff it into a machine and you, figuratively, of course, and if you have the right statistical structure, you can do anything. Maybe that's the way cognition works too. And then, it's definitely in cognitive science, people have made the case that a lot of cognition is about sort of statistical optimization. Like if you think about sensory motor coordination, a lot of that is about things like Fitts law, or can be described in that way, or things that involve very simple feedback loops and just optimizing those. So I mean, there are aspects of that. Or you can think about the free energy principle, even, where you're optimizing for sort of energy expenditure and things like that. So there is this aspect of that thing. But then, of course, maybe it's not that. Maybe you need to think about other types of ways to structure input data, ways to structure experience so that it fits into what's needed. And then, I don't know if they deal with this, but there's also this aspect of sort of what different forms of cognition or different intelligences need. So, for example, you may have a very simple intelligence that does the job that requires very little input. Or, you could use like a very simple training set and get a very simple intelligence. That intelligence might not scale, but it does the job. But there are other intelligences if you want to have if you want something that adapts to the real world or work on real-time data or whatever. It doesn't necessarily scale with the amount of data. It just needs a whole different approach or a whole different way of training. And so that's kind of what they're thinking about here. Stitching together a lot of the work of like Levin and other people who have worked on this problem for a long time. The contributions also raise broader issues concerning embodiment, complexity, learning architectures, and the social and scientific contexts in which world models operate. With this collection, we hope to clarify the conceptual landscape, identify key points of similarity and divergence between natural and artificial minds, and outline questions that may guide future research on the forms of world modeling that support grounded understanding, robust agency, potentially human-like general intelligence. Okay, so here it is. This special issue invited contributions focusing on the following questions. So there are 4 questions basically that were in the call for papers. The first is, what range of world models might we associate with which systems, and what are their functional properties with respect to inference and learning? The second one was, which kinds of world models might be associated with which conscious phenomena? So thinking about consciousness or about different types of things in cognition that we'd like to emulate. which kinds of world models might be associated with large language models, and to what extent this might change with further technological developments. And then which kinds of world models are characteristic of all life, ranging from animals to plants and fungi, or even individual cells. So, in posing these questions, we can basically say that world models have multiple meanings, each of which could be differently valuable for different contexts. However, such a broad range of connotations run the risk of becoming semantically vacuous or even misleading, perhaps akin to the way in which consciousness has become something of a suitcase word in cognitive science, and potentially a place for hiding our ignorance with respect to phenomena that challenge our understanding. So, again, we don't want a situation where world model is just kind of thrown around as a term of art without the actual art behind it. We want to have, and sometimes it's about like, this is what I mean by world model, or this is my world model, and it might be a world model for very small data sets. It might be a world model for very large types of biological data. It probably is not going to be a one size fits all thing. Yet, what if world models and consciousness had similar ambiguities, partially due to there being deep connections between these concepts, and that world modeling could potentially help explain how some physical systems have subjective experiences? That could be as well. And then this gets into sort of the different types of different papers in the volume. So, this is a quote from Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote one of the papers in the collection. And in his paper, he wrote, "There's no magical extra thing going on inside our organic human brains that makes their eyes realer than potential eyes of future computational systems." So when he talks about eyes, this goes back to some of the work that he's done on cognition and the strange loop stuff that he's done and all of that. So eyes, I think, stands for intelligence. And so, this is just kind of like saying that there is no real difference or anything magical, the difference between our brains or our minds and the minds of a computational system. It's just the presence of a complex and abstract pattern that I call a strange loop that is needed. So this is the strange loop reference. So when it comes about, and I fearfully suspect that it will come fairly soon, perhaps even by 2033, the real miracle will not be the leap of consciousness substrate from carbon to silicon. The greatest miracle was when inanimate matter gave rise to animate beings. Compared to that astonishing volcanic explosion a few billion years ago, the looming takeover of meaning, concepts, ideas, beliefs, thinking, sentience, and consciousness by computational entities from biological entities is just a minor blip in the steady march of evolution on the surface of planet Earth. And thus, perhaps sooner than you think, your royal I-ness will be looking up to an even more exalted I-ness. That's a day to greatly fear, so at least say I. He's very poetic in his writing, so, basically this means that you have different intelligences that aren't really that different. It's just kind of, um, just thinking about the different sort of, uh, maybe thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective and thinking about the different types of um, intelligences or consciousnesses that already exist. So that's what he's getting at here.
In the Daniel Fagella Worthy Successor camp of things, who very much appreciated the article series and praised Adam Safran on this, I think he would appreciate Hofstadter's comments in the sense of, oh yes, of course, there's a very particular natural trajectory of development that will supersede what is currently human. And so there are things coming and beyond us in that sense. So it's really interesting to see how that's going to play out with like different camps and then approaches in perhaps in the article series. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we go back to the special issue, of course, we have the introductory article. And then we have Douglas Hofstadter's article, Is There an I in AI? And so this is the one that I just talked about. That's where his little passage came from. And this is basically, here in a nutshell is a thesis of the essay. When words act like things in the world, then they refer to those things. Then they mean those things. If and when that happens, then thinking is taking place behind the scenes of those words. And when there is thinking, there is consciousness and a genuine full-fledged I. So that's basically the idea that he has. So it's about kind of this, thinking about language, thinking about how they're embodied in meaning, and then the thinking kind of results from action. And that's very consistent with what we think about in cognitive science. And so this is, of course, not just true of humans or of animals, even. This is true of large language models. And so thinking about the different behaviors. So the words thrown about by...
I think therefore I am.
Yeah, I guess so. That's a good way to put it. The words thrown around about by today's large language models mean something, exactly to the extent that their behavior matches with or meshes with the world's behavior. So this is a provocative example involving GPT-4. The response of GPT-4 to a prompt asking her to explain how to make a stable pile out of a book, a laptop computer, 9 eggs, a bottle and a nail, is kind of the idea. And then you have to kind of come up, the model has to come up with that response. And then it's basically, that is kind of here's your intelligence, I guess, a full-fledged intelligence. Where does the solution come from if not from understanding? And he talks about that this is stuff that people were thinking about 50 years ago. Terry Winograd's Shirtley program is, there's no real difference from that iteration of artificial minds, but it's very much greater. And so there's a greater understanding to be had from GPT-4, and that's what kind of makes it sort of, kind of mind-like, or at least people marvel at the mind-likeness of that model. So that's the first article. The second article, Large Language Models and Emergence. This is from David Krakauer, Melanie Mitchell, and John Krakauer. This is, again, just kind of thinking about large language models from a complex systems perspective, thinking about emergence as a component of this. So they talk about the More is Different article, which is a classic article in complexity theory that talks about, it sort of staked out the terms of emergent complexity and how that is a way we can think about interacting parts, producing something that is sort of at a level greater than the sort of the atomistic level of the components that are interacting. And so they talk about emergence as being this more is different idea. And then then we also have to think about intelligence, which is a consummate emergent property manifesting increasingly efficient uses of emergent capabilities to solve problems. This is captured by the idea less is more, which is actually a little bit different. In this paper, we examine claims that large language models exhibit emergent capabilities, and then secondly, ask whether large language models possess emergent intelligence. And so it kind of captures both of these ideas and brings them together. I think that'll be a good paper for people who want to know more about sort of, when people say that a solution that an agent is making is emergent, it's kind of emerging from different parts of the training data, that they be more precise about what they mean by emergence. In general, the concept of emergence has really suffered from a lack of precision throughout its history of use. So people will say something is emergent, and it's like, well, can you quantify the emergent properties of this system? And it's hard to do because Of course, it's based in interactions, but it's also somewhat subjective. You see something that isn't in the sort of the state of the parts of the system, and you say it's emergent, but you don't know whether that's a process that's constructed something new, or if it's just a product of things that are interacting and has no real descriptive value. And to understand that, you'd have to go back into the philosophy of emergence. But basically, there is this confusion as to whether something is emergent or not.
I'm curious to look at that in the context of, we've talked about Krakauer a fair amount in different, David Krakauer from Santa Fe recently,
Yeah.
and probably the last few years. But I'm curious of this version of his treatment of complexity and emergence. I really still like the Sean Carroll, I think it's Sean Carroll, Mindscapes podcast,
Yeah.
where he's because he gets at that. Towards, I think, the last quarter of it, that's when emergence kind of comes up, and he gets it. I think his take is, if I'm remembering him correctly, he was very much trying to rein in the scope of like emergence as a term, and I don't think he was dismissive. Is way too strong a word, but very aware of the problem. I think that Bradley just presented. So I'm curious how it comes off here in the context of this article series. So it was him, Mitchell, and his brother, the other Krakauer.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading that, and that might be something to kind of, I don't know. This whole issue is sort of extremely great fodder for, as we talked about recently, picking things up again, but also just like straight up cognition futures, and we'll see if I get into the diverse Dizzy, the summer school, but just like there's sort of this powder keg of, okay, we have all these opinions here presented in this article that's sort of custom made by Adam and Mike Levin, and I don't know. We'll see where it goes. I'm curious. We can go through as much as you want, but I'm curious. One of my questions, I may have to step out before 12 o'clock ends. I don't quite know yet.
Okay.
But I'm gonna want to slip this question in for them to think about it. Sort of like, what do you want to do next? And I don't. We can go back to the articles, but like, do you have any like particular follow-up you want to do? Or I'm also in the back of my mind, I'm doing some of the website updates and things, and like, oh yeah, like the reimagining cybernetic projects, cybernetics interest groups, whatever we're calling it. But like, is there any particular directions you want to go with, not just our article, but like kind of this topic that's on your mind?
So I think there are a couple things that I can think off the top of my head that would be worth pursuing. The first, of course, is the sort of the core model that was proposed in the paper here. I mean, you have a certain amount of space you can use, and you have to introduce things and motivate them and put them into the context of what we want for the special issue, right? So we had to talk about certain things there. But I think there's a more general kind of development of the model, is taking the model maybe and applying it to very specific problems, or seeing like, maybe there's a cybernetics theoretical question, which is, what is, when we talk about good regulation, and we defined, I think we did do a good job of defining it, sort of putting the nails in the board to keep it kind of from floating off into space. But it's still, what do you mean by good regulation? Are there things that you can add or subtract from the model that would kind of deviate from that? And a lot of that has to do with kind of its relationship to control theory, which is not, something I'm an expert in, but definitely has some ties back to things like reinforcement learning and active inference. And so that's something we didn't get to explore too much in the paper, but is interesting from a sort of a perspective, especially like active inference, because we've been doing a lot of interaction with the Active Inference Institute. And I think it'd be interesting to see kind of that modern treatment of the good regulator. And so that's one thing. Another thing is to say maybe talk more about like maybe get another concept from cybernetics and look at that in relation to the Evergood regulator theorem. So now that we have the Evergood regulator theorem sort of explored enough to kind of bring that into the modern world or consider it in the modern context, what other concepts can we do that with? So I don't remember, and there are a lot of concepts from the cybernetics literature that are really interesting, but that kind of live in this space of like 50 years ago. So
Right. Like, yeah.
So anyways, yeah, and we could do something like that, or applying this to sort of more directly to an applied setting of like machine learning, where you think about like actual algorithms, improving upon algorithms, and things like that, or even like for agents, like if we plugged the Evergood regulator into a Brainberg vehicle, what would that look like? Because Brainberg vehicles are this sort of very simple first order feedback, and that's like good for like reproducing maybe certain behaviors, like taxis, like chemotaxis or phototaxis. But what happens if we like build a model of good regulation? It's a little bit more detailed. We have an observer, things like that. What can we do with a Brainberg vehicle? I don't know.
Yeah, and like I apologies sort of bringing that up in a maybe unprepared fashion, but it's something that I'm thinking about a little bit. I don't have any concrete leads beyond well, not even concrete, but many leads beyond what you said. But I feel like there's definitely. I kind of hope that Amanda gets to. I don't know if she's read the published version in the context of the other articles yet or not, but I'm hoping to reconnect with her soon, and she's at different time zones now, so maybe that discussion, if we can get her or all of us together, sort of a Create Your Futures reading group type, or cybernetics reading group, kind of both the same or whatever. Some kind of a informal meeting of us together, I think would churn out some interesting things to that end. But yeah, I feel like there's both to like champion cybernetics theory and reimagining cybernetics, whatever sense, yes, but also just seeing some of the ways. I think going through the articles in the issue might be quite fruitful on many related fronts. So I think that's what I'm going to try to do next. In maybe a week or two when I have the actual time to read that material. But yeah, I don't know. It's just I feel I'm tantalized by all this like cool stuff and the different authors, their perspectives, and like, okay, great. And maybe because I'm always striving for some of the synthetic work, and maybe doing some kind of a review on the special issue itself will be a step forward too. But that's it. I don't have any. It wasn't a question that I already knew the answer to.
Yeah.
So we'll see where that goes.
Okay. Well, we'll continue on with the special issue here. So that was this article. Then there's levels of analysis for large language models. That's Thomas Griffiths, Alexander Koo, and some other people. This is, of course, it has to do with Mars levels of analysis. And of course, if you remember that, it's where you have these different levels of sort of cognitive analysis. So, it goes from sort of a hypothetical space to an implementation space, basically. And so this paper kind of frames language models or large language models into that framework. So it's kind of thinking about studying, interrogating the cognitive aspects of these models from Mars framework. So modern artificial intelligence systems, such as large language models, are increasingly powerful but also increasingly hard to understand. Recognizing this problem is analogous to historical difficulties in understanding the human mind. We argue that methods developed in cognitive science can be useful for understanding large language models. We propose a framework for applying these methods based on the levels of analysis that David Marr proposed for studying information processing systems. By revisiting cognitive science techniques relevant to each level and illustrating their potential to yield insights into the behavior and internal organization of large language models, we aim to provide a toolkit for making sense of these new kinds of minds. So they throw down the gauntlet and they give this example from David Marr's 3 levels. So this table kind of summarizes this. The first is level of analysis is computational. And so the level of inquiry at this first level of analysis is what problem is being solved and what is the ideal solution. This table gets cut off in the HTML version, but anyways. Let me see if I can pull up the... Okay, actually it gets cut off here too. I don't know why. Okay, so let's go through this way. Actually, no, we can do the PDF, right? There we go. Okay. So this is the full table. All right. So the first level of analysis is computational, and that is what problem is being solved and what is the ideal solution. And then there's this distinction between cognitive science and artificial intelligence. So in terms of cognitive science, this computational level is understanding behavior in terms of optimal solutions to environmental pressures. So the computational level of analysis, an example would be Bayesian models of cognition. In artificial intelligence, because cognitive science is about bridging that gap in part between AI and human systems or cognitive systems more generally, you have, it's kind of, when Marr was thinking about his levels of analysis, he was also thinking about artificial intelligence. At that time, it was connectionism, but still you had this analogy. So in artificial intelligence, the computational level of analysis is understanding behavior in terms of the training objective. So this is where instead of thinking about optimal solutions to environmental pressures, you're thinking about the training objective. So this is something like next token prediction, but also understanding behavior in terms of deviations from optimal benchmarks. So an example of that would be violations of probability axioms. So basically the computational level in cognitive science, it's a Bayesian model that is, has a prior distribution, and then you sort of correct your output based on correcting or refining those priors to match the environment. In AI, we're doing things like next token prediction, which is very proximal, and then these violations of probability axioms, which deal with out of distribution data. We made a similar argument in our paper about different, when we were thinking about avalanches and the role of the observer. So the observer deals with these larger global issues, the regulator deals with these proximal issues. The next level of analysis is algorithmic. So that's how is the solution approximated and what representations and processes are involved. So this is in cognitive science, it's inferring mental representation and processes. They're behavioral experiments. So these could be things like reaction times, error patterns, or similarity judgments. And then thinking about an algorithm of behavior, basically. And then in artificial intelligence, algorithmic level of analysis is inferring representations and processes via behavioral analysis. So this is analyzing systematic errors, soliciting similarity judgments, uncovering hidden associations. So it's really thinking about that algorithm at the core of the cognitive process. And then implementation level of analysis, which is how are the representations and processes physically realized. So this is where you're of course dealing with neural circuits in cognition, in animal cognition. You're dealing with population activity of neurons, and you can measure those with single unit recordings, fMRI, or MVPA. It's basically verifying the behavior with some mechanism. And so in cognition, we often have neural circuits. So the cognition behaves on these neural circuits. We don't really understand how it works, but we can infer certain things about that process. And it's, in cognition, we often use the analogy that it's software running on hardware, but really it's probably not that. It's probably more involved. So, we need to look at that implementation on hardware, mind the analogy, to really understand the behavior and how it's generated. So in artificial intelligence, we have a similar thing where we study artificial neurons, circuits, in population activity using techniques like activation patching, sparse autoencoders, and representational geometry analysis. Basically looking at things like a neural network or a connectionist network, and then looking at, like, we can trace back to the pattern of activation within those networks. So we talked about methods last week that people use at Anthropic to do that. And there are other types of methods like credit assignment that are important. So kind of basically what the pattern of activation is for a certain concept. And you can trace that back. And so it makes the artificial intelligence system more interpretable, and it allows you to really understand how the activations are being generated. So maybe if something is spurious or not. So that was a good kind of a way to address, at least in terms of cognitive science, being a rigorous cognitive scientist, addressing this idea of intelligent behavior. Okay. And then this next paper is Goals and the Structure of Experience. This is a paper that I remember as a preprint. We cited this in another paper. This is Stas Tiomkin, Angela Langdon, and Nadav Amir. And this is on sort of this idea of sort of purposeful behavior and goals, and how this, how we can think about this. So purposeful behavior is a hallmark of natural and artificial intelligence. So we know that there is this concept of purpose in cybernetics as well. If we go back to the paper on the 1943 paper that we talked about in our reading group, and
behavior, purpose, and teleology.
Yes, behavior, purpose, and teleology. People have been thinking about this in cybernetics, but also in cognition. So the acquisition of purposeful behavior is often believed to rely on world models comprising both descriptive what is and prescriptive what is desirable aspects that identify and evaluate states of affairs in the world, respectively. Canonical computation accounts for purposeful behavior, such as reinforcement learning, posit distinct components of a world model comprising a state representation and a reward function. So you often have in things like reinforcement learning a descriptive aspect, which is the state representation, and a reward function, which is a prescriptive aspect of behavior. So basically, when you're looking at purpose, you think about that a system does something, it tries to achieve something with a prescriptive thing that it's trying to achieve it with. So, you have these rewards for different behaviors or different states. The highest reward is selected, and then that behavior is implemented. And then that, like, if the reward is consistently high, that state will be consistently represented. That's basically the idea of purposeful behavior, that it's this function of reward, but also this output that you can measure. However, an alternative possibility, which has not yet been computationally formalized, is that these two aspects instead co-emerge interdependently from an agent's goal. So oftentimes in reinforcement learning, we think of rewards being sort of the precursor to state representations, but we don't, maybe that's not the case, because rewards are continually updated. And it is this loop of where you have rewards, you have states, the rewards get updated, the states get updated, and one has to result from the other. We can think of the causality, if at a very superficial level, we think the causality is basically a reward will determine what states are represented in the behavior. But if we think about the whole system as this set of feedback loops, or this sort of circular causality, then it's a little bit different, because then we can't really identify where the rewards change and where the state representation changes and so forth. So these things have to co-emerge in some way, and they co-emerge from an agent's goal. So we can actually look at the goal as the causal agent that changes both of these. Here we describe a computational framework of goal-directed state representation and cognitive agents, in which the descriptive and prescriptive aspects of a world model co-emerge from agent-environment interaction sequences or experiences. And so here they're drawing from Buddhist epistemology, where they introduce a construct of goal-directed or telic states defined as classes of goal-equivalent experience distributions. Telic states provide a parsimonious account of goal-directed learning in terms of the statistical divergence between behavioral policies and desirable experience features. Okay, so that's we cited that in the paper that we did on cybernetic imperatives. So this was the preprint version. So a lot of these papers have lived as preprints before they were in the special issue. So that was that paper. The next paper is what does it mean to have an experience? Two kinds of narrative world models. This is an individual contribution, and this talks about sort of the narrative world model, which organizes actions and events into temporal episodes with defined beginnings and endings, linking these endings to emotional outcomes. And so this is kind of thinking about the role of narrative and the structure of narrative in building these world models. And this is important, of course, for large language models, because they deal with narratives. They build narratives. Then there's human level learning of complex novel tasks is theory-based modeling, exploration, and planning. This is a paper by a number of authors, including Josh Tenenbaum and Sam Gershman. This next article is Empowerment Gain in Causal Model Construction. Children and adults are sensitive to controllability and variability in their causal interventions. This is, a developmental perspective. This is Alison Gopnik is on this paper, along with some of the co-authors here. And so this is about, Alison Gopnik does this work with development and thinking about development as applied to artificial intelligence. So in this paper, the abstract talks about learning about the causal structure of the world is a fundamental problem for human cognition. So learning about the causal structure and development, learning what comes first, what comes next. And learning that from interacting with the world. So if you're a baby, you interact with the world, you figure out how things work through causal structure, and you kind of experiment with things, and that's how you develop this sort of intuition about causality. Causal models, and especially causal learning, have proved to be difficult for large pre-trained models using standard techniques of deep learning. So we know kind of that this happens in the development of animals, of humans, but we can't necessarily replicate this in artificial systems. In contrast, cognitive scientists have applied advances in our formal understanding of causation in computer science, particularly within the causal Bayes net formalism. So they're using Bayesian formalisms for this to understand human causal learning. In the very different tradition of reinforcement learning, or OREL, researchers have described an intrinsic reward signal called empowerment, which maximizes mutual information between actions and their outcomes. So this is like comparing kind of the standard approach of causal Bayes nets with this idea of empowerment in reinforcement learning. Empowerment may be an important bridge between classical Bayesian causal learning and reinforcement learning, and may help to characterize causal learning in humans and enable it in machines. So we can actually use this concept of empowerment to think about, or this is an intrinsic reward signal, to think about, the way this works in animals, and then think about how to apply it to machines. And if an agent learns an accurate causal world model, they will necessarily increase their empowerment, and increasing empowerment will lead to a more accurate causal world model. So it's this sort of circular causality in the sense that you have this conceptual thing, this feature that you're building into the model, and you basically use it to acquire this world model that will increase the empowerment of the model, which increases its ability to understand causality. So they bootstrap each other. Empowerment may also explain distinctive features of children's causal learning, as well as provide a more tractable computational account of how that learning is possible. In an empirical study, we systematically test how children and adults use cues to empowerment to infer causal relations and design effective causal interventions. So they actually brought from some studies here from human children, to show how this works. Okay, this next article, a sentence is worth 1,000 pictures. Can large language models understand human language and world behind words? So this is using LeetSpeak, I guess. And there may be a reason for this. This is Gary Marcus as an author on this, by the way. So the abstract reads, the current generation of large language models has been linked to claims about human-like linguistic performance, and their applications are hailed both as a step towards artificial general intelligence and as a major advance in understanding the cognitive and even neural bases of human language. To assess these claims, first, we analyze the contribution of large language models as theoretically informative representations of a target cognitive system versus atheoretical mechanistic tools. Second, we evaluate the model's ability to see the bigger picture through top-down feedback from higher levels of processing, which requires grounding in previous expectations and past world experience. We hypothesize that since models lack grounded cognition, they cannot take advantage of these features, and instead solely relies on fixed associations between represented words and word vectors. So they actually use, in the assessment, they use a novel LEET task, which explains the LeetSpeak in the title, which requires decoding sentences in which letters are systematically replaced by numbers. So LeetSpeak is where you're replacing letters with numbers. So in human, the A is a 4. In language, the A's are 4s. And then the world and words, those words both have zeros instead of O's. So it's a cipher, basically. And so the model has to learn that pattern and then decode that. In line with our hypotheses, the results suggest that humans excel at this task, whereas models struggle. We interpret these results by identifying the key abilities that are still missing from the current state of development of these models, which requires solutions that go beyond increased system scaling. So that's kind of their take on this. It's an interesting kind of study. So some of these are, kind of ideas driven, theoretical. Some of these are studies. Okay, then there's unexpected benefits of self-modeling in neural systems. This is actually Michael Graziano is on this paper with some co-authors. So he does a lot of things in thinking about consciousness and other types of cognitive science issues. So this is thinking about self-models and self-modeling in cognition, and that's sort of the basis for his work on consciousness. So, thinking about modeling the self in the mind. Um, so how do you apply that to, you know, different types of artificial systems? So self models have been a topic of interest for decades in human cognition and more recently in machine learning. Yet what benefits do self models confer? Here we show that when an artificial network learns to predict its internal states as an auxiliary task, the network becomes simpler, more regularized, and more parameter efficient. So this is where you want to be able to predict internal states. So this is something that oftentimes artificial networks don't do. They don't have internal states. They don't have a model of the self. And so being able to do that, it makes for a more efficient network just simply because it's reflecting on its own inputs. It's reflecting on its processing. And this is very similar to the types of things we see in interoception, where you have sensory abilities in animals where it can detect the state of the body, the state of the self, and that can feed into cognition that way. To test these hypotheses of self-regularizing through self-modeling, we used a range of network architectures, performing 3 classification tasks across 2 modalities. So in all cases, adding self-modeling caused a significant reduction in network complexity. The reduction was observed in 2 ways. So the first way is the distribution of weights was narrower when self-modeling was present. Second, a measure of network complexity, the real log canonical threshold, or RLCT, was smaller when self-modeling was present. So complexity decreased, the distribution of weights became narrower, and the predictability, becomes higher, and the precision becomes higher. These results support the hypothesis that self-modeling has a restructuring effect, reducing complexity and increasing parameter efficiency. This self-regularization may help explain some of the benefits of self-models reported in recent machine learning literature findings, as well as the adaptive value of self-models to biological systems. In particular, these findings may shed light on the possible interaction between the ability to model oneself and the ability to be more easily modeled by others in a social or cooperative context. This is, of course, feeds in this idea of the body schema, which is the brain's model of the physical body, and having a body schema for an agent. Now, an agent, of course, if it's not embodied, what is the body schema? Well, it could be something just having to do with more generally with an internal state. So this is where you're just monitoring performance and then putting it in the context of current performance. So it's an interesting concept. How to apply it to a model? Well, that's kind of, maybe it's a test of embodiment, in fact. Maybe we do need embodiment for something like this. But again, these papers raise a lot of questions, and that's what this is for. It's for kind of driving future work. This is, of course, our article, which I won't go through because we're already familiar with it. This is a paper by Dalton, Michael Levin, and Francesco Sacco, Topological Constraints on Self-Organization in Locally Interacting Systems. And this is kind of getting at this idea of emergence and self-organization, and thinking about how there's a topology there. So all intelligence is collective intelligence in the sense that it is made of parts and must align with respect to systems level goals. To that end, consider a system on the vertices of a planar graph with pairwise interactions prescribed by the edges of the graph. Such systems can exhibit long-range order, distinguishing one phase of macroscopic behavior from another. In a network of interacting systems, we may view spontaneous ordering as a form of self-organization, modeling neural and basal forms of cognition. Here we discuss necessary conditions, the topology of the graph for an ordered phase to exist, with an eye towards finding constraints on the ability of the system with local interactions to maintain an ordered target state. So this is actually introducing this idea of free energy and the free energy principle. So thinking about these kinds of models of networks and thinking about long-range order and how those things kind of come together. This is very physics-like. They consider three different types of model systems. The POTS model, which is this cellular POTS model, which is used in CompuCell 3D, but it's a physics model that deals with these lattices and coordination across lattices. They also consider autoregressive models, which are very important in different sequences in machine learning models. So we often use autoregression, large language models, and we use autoregression, of course, in our avalanche models as well. So it's very important to sequential data and things like that. And then hierarchical networks, where you have structure that's hierarchical, that you have things underneath other things. And again, those are all kind of these can serve as these sort of distributed systems with long-range order. So from these three model systems, we show how the combinatorics of interactions on a graph prevent or allow spontaneous ordering. As an application, we are able to analyze why multi-scale systems, like those prevalent in biology, are capable of organizing into complex patterns, whereas rudimentary language models are challenged by long sequences of outputs. So it's basically trying to build upon the sequential nature of language and the sequential nature of data to improve in thinking about like how this is dealt with in physics and how this is dealt with in cognition, to bring that into artificial intelligence models. So it's an interesting kind of approach there. There's another paper by Georg Northoff, Samir Abbasi, and Yasser Katal. What physics offers for artificial intelligence, lessons from the brain's inner time and its dynamics. And this sounds like it's sort of a neuroscience paper. So this is actually thinking about dynamical neuroscience and the different scales of activity in the brain over time, and thinking about synchronization and how that all can be applied to different types of AI models. It's really interesting. They approach this from the perspective of the brain's intrinsic neural dynamics, of spontaneous activity. So, this is the structure of a lot of experience. So, in particular, we focus on the brain's intrinsic neural dynamics of spontaneous activity and how it uses them for dynamic input processing and encoding in order to participate in the world's physical time. And so what they mean by participate in this context is that behavior becomes part of the input dynamics. So again, it's that loop where you have things that are happening now that go back and become part of the input for the next time step. And so there's this circular causality that's inherent in this sort of participation. And so when you think about things like listening and dancing to music or other types of behaviors where it's dependent on interacting with a stimulus, these are all things that are very much in this vein. So, if you think about an artificial intelligence model, if you just train a model and then separate the training from the testing, you don't have this problem. But when you integrate the training and testing, in other words, when you have to train the model in real time as it's behaving and trying to predict things, especially when you don't have sort of a baseline training, then this is where this comes into play. And this can build up a world model from experience. And they use this analogy of sort of dynamical uh, neuroscience to sort of draw from for this. Okay, so that's sort of the physical perspective and how to think about that. And then this another article by Michael Levin with Nicholas Rouleau, which is Brains and Where Else, Mapping Theories of Consciousness to Unconventional Embodiments. And so this is where thinking about theories of consciousness and how this is associated with brains. So it is assumed that a useful theory of consciousness will explain why consciousness is associated with brains. However, the findings of evolutionary biology, developmental bioelectricity, and synthetic bioengineering reveal ancient pre-neural roots of many mechanisms and algorithms occurring in brains. So this is again this idea of diverse intelligences. Minds may have preceded brains. And you can get, into this literature, and there are these different constructs people have used to hypothesize what minds look like in physics. There are things like Boltzmann brains and things like that. Anyways, this is kind of grounding this a little bit more rigorously. So most work in the emerging field of diverse intelligences emphasizes externally observable problem-solving competencies in unconventional media, such as cells, tissues, and life technology chimeras. So these are just organisms that are made from two different organisms, or systems made from two different organisms, where you can combine different types of capabilities into a single test bed. Here we inquire about the implications of these developments on theories of mind. Specifically, we analyze popular current theories of mind to ask what features of each theory specifically pick out brains as a privileged substrate for inner perspective, or do features emphasized by the theory occur elsewhere? So do you need a brain for a mind, or can you run a mind somewhere else? And, this ties back to a lot of Levin's ideas about cellular minds and things like that. And of course, there are single cell organisms that don't have a brain that do things that are very cognitive. And there are a lot of papers on this where they explore things in different model organisms, single cell organisms that are, very cognitive, and you can interpret their behavior as cognitive. And so you can have different substrates that you would find, say, in single cells that have very similar brains. So you could have like a substrate of biochemical reactions, and it would do very similar things to brains. So that's what they're getting at with this, that you can basically, if you use that hardware-software analogy again, the hardware could be anything that is complex, and the software is still the mind, that you might have a set of biochemical reaction networks that do things that are mind-like, not because the biochemical network is similar to brains, but because it just provides a substrate for computation. And one of the things you might think of is like, so the mind is this thing that floats around evolution and kind of affixes itself to different systems? No, it's just simply that the mind in this case is a set of imperatives, or a set of things that or a single cell organism or an organism with a very complex brain needs to do, and it just uses the substrate that's available to it. I mean, it still doesn't describe, or it still doesn't predict why we might have large brains or complex brains or simple brains or whatever, but it is a thing worth asking as to whether you need brains to have intelligent behavior, to have minds. And so this, of course, is relevant to artificial systems. We don't need to mimic the brain when we build an artificial intelligence, if this is the case. But it also describes maybe other modes of intelligence where in lineages of the tree of life where you don't have brains, like single cell organisms, or even in slime molds, which we see collective behaviors that are mind-like. Okay, so again, they ask this question about the theory of mind, that it could occur outside of brains in that context. We find that operations and functional principles of most theories of mind are not confined to neural substrates, and that the focus on brains is more driven by convention than by specific context of existing theories of consciousness. Encouragingly, several contemporary theorists have made an explicit effort to apply their theories to synthetic systems in light of recent technological developments in artificial intelligence and organoid bioengineering. So they have the organoid reference in here. We talked about organoid intelligence and how that substrate is actually, I guess, quasi-neural, because you may have brain organoids that do things that are intelligent, or you may even have just regular organoids that are clusters of cells in association that form the system, and they may actually do things that are mind-like. So in organoid intelligence, of course, we have that simple sensory motor feedback loop that we can use to play Pong. That's a brain organoid, but it's not exactly the same substrate that we generate that behavior with, say, in humans. And so that suggests that it's substrate independent. So we suggest that the science of consciousness should remain open to minds and unconventional embodiments. It's a lesson from that paper. Okay, and then there's another paper by Michael Levin with Benjamin Lyons, who Jesse mentioned. And this is Cognitive Glues or Shared Models of Relative Scarcities, the Economics of Collective Intelligence. This has to do with this concept of cognitive glue and just thinking about the technological approaches to mind everywhere idea, or TAME, which Levin introduced in another paper. So thinking about an economy as a complex system consisting of autonomous elements at multiple scales, which exhibit adaptive problem-solving capabilities, is a way to think about complex systems, and thinking about maybe how a distributed emergent system can solve problems like a mind. So they're thinking about an economy in a society where people are exchanging things, and the economy has its own sort of self-regulation capabilities and things like that. So, what keeps that system running? And that's the idea of a cognitive glue. So if you think about like a distributed system, like an economy as a mind, then what's the cognitive glue that keeps that going? And so it turns out that it's not the agents necessarily, it's the price system, which is the cognitive glue of the economy, by acting as a coordinating affordance that enables members to form plans that are mutually compatible. So this is the thing that sort of enables this emergent phenomena in the economy, the self-regulating emergence, and this is the price system. So using the collective intelligence framework of TAME, we elaborate on various aspects of the economy that make it useful to model the economy as a collective intelligence. We argue that any cognitive glue must solve the same kinds of problems that the price system solves, and broadly the same way that the price system solves it. And thus the price system serves as a generic template or abstract model for all cognitive glues. Finally, we describe some research ideas that combine concepts from biology and economics in hopes of inspiring interdisciplinary collaboration. So we're dealing here with these self-organizing emergent systems that have agents that are interacting, and those interactions form this higher level order. Now there's of course something holding this all together, which is the price system that's enabling the interactions between people, enabling efficient interactions between people. And that is this idea of the cognitive glue, and that coordinates everything and makes sure that this thing operates in an intelligent manner. So, you don't have people chasing prices that are suboptimal. Usually have people chasing the cheapest price, or maybe charging the most for things when they can, and things like that, and knowing those things across the market. So this is an interesting idea, and you can apply this more broadly than the economy. It's just the system they used, but it's definitely, and I think if we think back to our open source communities. What's the cognitive glue of an open source community? I don't know. It could be like integrity. It could be trust. It could be sort of a value in the project. It could be like maybe maintenance of the project. There are a lot of things that could be the cognitive glue there, but it's worth thinking about as a they classify as mathematical finance and systems theory. So thinking about this in terms of an artificial system, you might have like this might be something where if you have teams of agents where this becomes very important. Okay, then there are two other papers. There's Revisiting Rogers Paradox in the Context of Human AI Interaction, and then Artificial Intelligence for Science, the Easy and Hard Problems. I'll talk about the last one here. This is the Sam Gershman Ray Battle Day paper. And this is where they're thinking about how to apply AI to science. So the abstract reads, a suite of impressive scientific discoveries have been driven by recent advances in artificial intelligence. These almost all result from training flexible algorithms to solve difficult optimization problems specified in advance by teams of domain scientists and engineers with access to large amounts of data. Okay, so these seem like, we know kind of what, we're kind of waiting for the method to solve these problems with. But again, this is the kind of thing that is, these are easy problems. These are things that we know we can solve with artificial intelligence. So if we think back to some of the work that's been done on protein folding and simulating protein dynamics, that was originally done by teams of scientists using like physics engines and things like that, and they were able to achieve a lot, and then AI came along and helped do that work faster. So it wasn't that it enabled a new mode of discovery, but it just basically built upon the previous work that was done, just doing it faster and more efficiently. So we had the domain experts, we had we actually had the algorithms. We just needed to make them go faster and have a sort of something that would help us enable some of the things we couldn't do with, we had limitations of computational power. We had other problems that got solved through artificial intelligence. So the easy problems are extremely useful for sort of identifying the utility of using AI for solving scientific problems. But these kinds of problems are really easy in the sense that they're already well worked out and that we know kind of the parameters for which the solution resides. So we're just looking for the solution. On the other hand, the other part of scientific research is coming up with the problem itself, or the hard problem. And this is the thing that we can't really do with current algorithms. So when we talk about things like an AI scientist, the AI scientist, is trying to do the latter. So it's like where we feed a bunch of data into the algorithm or into an AI model, and we expect to get out of it some sort of insight, some sort of problem that's novel that can solve something in the real world. So this is the hard problem. This is actually what a lot of scientific research actually is, setting up the problem to be solved. So at one time, protein folding was this kind of hard problem where we didn't know why proteins folded and we had to figure that out. We had many years to do that, and then once we figured that out, then we applied our AI model. In this case, what we're saying in the AI scientist case is we might approach a novel issue by maybe going through a bunch of data, training a model, and then identifying these questions. And then furthermore, identifying how to solve it. That's a harder problem because a lot of times there are gaps in expertise that need to be overcome. A lot of times there are conceptual revisions that need to be made. Sometimes the constraints are poorly defined of the problem, so it's hard for an artificial system to understand things, whereas a domain expert would know, they'd have an intuition for what would work and what wouldn't. So these are all things that they're kind of considering here in terms of the hard problem. So we can make progress in understanding how humans solve the hard problem by studying the cognitive science of scientists, and then use the results to design new computational agents that automatically infer and update their scientific paradigms. So in this case, it's about kind of understanding how humans solve these hard problems, how experts do this, and then design new computational agents to do this sort of AI scientist type thing. So, they talk about the problem of optimization, the problem with optimization. And so this is where, optimization is great when you already know what the question is. But when you don't know what the question is, then it's harder to sort of lock on to the relevant problems. So this is kind of the basis for this whole idea of the AI scientist. And to do that, you need to go back into the philosophy of science and understand how science is done. And this actually, I like this section because it draws from like Herbert Simon's work, and it draws from Popper, and how these things kind of conflict. And then talks about solving the hard problem, where you need to have domain specification and constraint specification. So in domain specification, what are the relevant phenomena that need to be explained by a theory, versus constraint specification, or what kinds of constraints need to be imposed on a theory based on existing knowledge. So these are things that, of course, domain experts can do, not always well, but they do them they do that without generating things that are not relevant, or being able to actually make breakthroughs, whereas AIs really struggle with all this.